Okay.
Thank you.
Beth needs this sheet.
We're inconsistent sometimes.
Oh,
It's like,
well,
oh yeah,
that's
think
all
of
right.
that, digging it up.
That's all right. Can you pass me? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's begin with prayer. Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to come here every week without worrying about being stopped on our way or asked where we're going or followed home, like many of our brothers and sisters in other places. We thank you for the opportunity to just be here to hear your word openly taught, preached, prayed, sung, and we just ask your Spirit be with us today as we do all these things. Lord, open our minds to understand your word. Convict us where we need to be convicted. Encourage us where we need to be encouraged. And this morning in this class, as we continue to meditate upon the amazing mysteries of how you, Almighty God, interact with us finite beings to bring about your plans and what you've decreed, Lord, it can be overwhelming for us, and we can be tempted to think about these things in the abstract. But we ask that you would be with us today to help to point us to how these truths glorify you, how these truths can encourage us and give us confidence, and yet also, Lord, just how important it is for us to seek to have our wills aligned with yours and our choices aligned with you in a way that is going to be honoring to you and glorifying to you, that you will bless us, Lord. We just thank you for Jesus Christ, Lord, which makes this relationship possible. Thank you for your Holy Spirit, which gives us your word, Lord, and helps us to understand it. And we just ask you'd be with us this morning. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, so you need notes, Tim?
Yeah.
Morning, Tim.
Morning.
Wifeless Tim.
Aw.
Aww.
I still have a wife.
You do.
Yeah.
She's just far away.
So last week we began looking at the relationship of human free will and God's sovereignty, and how he controls history through his providence. And we discussed two different perspectives or theories on freedom. And the first theory was known as the forking paths model, or libertine free will, LFW. And that holds that freedom consists in the power of contrary choice. That means that a person's choices are only free if they could have done otherwise given the same set of circumstance. And so that entails the idea that in order to be free, a person has to have the ability to actualize or determine a different future based upon their choices or the decisions they make. So does that make sense? You understand that? That's what most people, I think, mean when they say free will, right? If most people are talking about whether people have free will, that's usually what they're talking about. The second theory is known as the source model, or compatibilist view of freedom. This view teaches that choices are free as long as you're able to choose to do what you desire to do. If you can do what you want to do, then you're free. Nobody's stopping you from doing what you want or forcing you to do something that you don't want, then that's a free choice. And if you're the source of that decision, you can be held accountable for that decision, even if you couldn't have chosen something different. And that means that the future can be certain and set, and you can still be making free choices, and those two things are compatible with one another logically, which is why it's often called compatibilism. Does that make sense? Do you get the idea behind that one? I'm seeing sort of
That
like
one's a little more
the slow
Yeah,
nod, like
that's
I
a
want to
little-
nod, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
All right, well, listen, I think if you kind of get it, but you're not really sure you get it, I really think today will be helpful to you, because we're going to look at actual scripture that I think will illustrate how this works. So as we think about which of these views is consistent with the Bible, one of the things that we can do is ask the question, does the Bible ever answer the question as to whose choices determine future outcomes? So what I mean by that is libertine freedom requires your choice to make a different future, right? You could have chosen another alternative, therefore the result would have been different if you had chosen differently. And so, does the Bible ever answer that question? And I think it does. And I'm going to argue that it does in many places. We're only going to look at a few. And I think that the way it answers the question affirms the compatibilist view. So I am teaching and I am telling you that I believe the Bible answers this question and answers it more consistent with the compatibilist view. And I think that because I think that the Bible clearly answers who determines what the future is. As we read Scripture carefully, I think we have to come to the inevitable conclusion that in every case, when we look at a set of circumstances and ask who determined this, we have to give two answers. So real free choices are made by people who are held accountable for them, and so their choices are determining what happens. Yet, those choices inevitably result in bringing about what God has decreed to come to pass. So, just like the compatibilist view says, God brings about the ends he determines through secondary causes, which are the free choices of human beings, or it includes the free choices of human beings. So, I'll just pause one more time for if there's a question or clarification, but I really think it's easier to understand when you see it working. So we'll get to that in a second. But any questions on what the view is or what I'm saying here so far in the introduction?
So I guess maybe where I might be stuck is that, okay, God has a certain end in his mind.
That's correct.
And that end will come about because he says my will be done.
That's right.
And that is done through our free choices. So there's no puppeteer. You know how people say we're not puppets.
That's
so
right.
How does that work?
Yep. Let me kind of try to explain that real quickly. And I apologize. Last week I was drawing things on the board. We have people following along on audio only, and so they had no idea what I was talking about. I'll try to. So the libertine view of freedom, the thing most people think about is when you're and I've got a straight line, you come to a decision point. I think I used the illustration. I'm at lunch today and I can either have Coke to drink or I can have tea to drink. Right? Mm-hmm. So the libertine view says that choice is only free if that person can actually create a future where they had Coke or a future where they had tea. They have to have the ability to do differently than they did in the same circumstances in order for that view to be, or in order for that choice to be free. Now that seems pretty straightforward. The compatibilist view says this. You're coming along and you come to a decision point. Same question. So this is, let's say there's a 50%. This isn't, I'm simplifying this. On the Coke or tea, you could go either way. Same question, Coke or tea. God has determined before he created the universe that you are going to have Coke. This is 100% certain choice. He knows that you're going to have Coke. He doesn't just know it, and we'll get to this later when we get to election, God's relationship to his foreknowledge. He doesn't just know it, but you having Coke is part of his plan because there's a billion other things connected with any event, right? You've ever heard of the butterfly effect? You do one thing and by the time a butterfly flaps its wings, by the time it gets to the other side of the world, it's a storm. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point is every choice somebody makes affects somebody else and the choices they're making. So God knows and has determined as part of his plan that I'm going to have Coke today. Now, how is that? So I can't actually choose tea. It's certain that I won't choose tea. The future is set. I'm going to have Coke. So how is this a free choice? The compatibilist view is saying, at this moment, God doesn't force me to have Coke. God doesn't, it's not like I wanted tea and God prevented me from having tea. I freely chose Coke. That's what was my desire. That's what I wanted to do. And so even though it's certain that that's what is going to happen, that was still a free choice. I made that choice. So when you say this freedom, this compatibilist view of freedom does not require that the choices that I make actualize a different future. What they require is that they proceed from me as the source, that I'm morally accountable for them because they're unforced. That's what I wanted to do. Does that make sense?
So it's based on a desire.
It is. And next week we'll wrap this up. I'll give you a little bit more detail on how it works. But the question is, which of these views does the Bible teach? People who argue for the first view would say, well, we're held accountable for our choices. It's very clear. And it's also clear that our choices are real. If I had tea, that has a different set of consequences than if I have Coke. However, if me having Coke is part of God's plan, I'm not going to change that, even though I'm making a free choice. So we'll come back to this, but I think I want to show you kind of how it works. But in a sense, it has to do with your nature and your desires. If I put a plate full of salad on the floor and a plate full of raw hamburger on the floor, and I let my dog loose, that dog is freely going to choose hamburger. I can guarantee it. Like, I can bet on it, right? I didn't make the dog do that. It's a free choice, even though it was certain. And I could have planned around that because I know that's what's going to happen. Well, God has perfect knowledge, and there's even more going on with God, which we'll talk about later. But that's the difference between how the choices work. Paul?
One way to frame it, too, is does God have to surrender his sovereignty in order to allow human beings to have some degree of freedom?
Right. No, right. So what I'm saying here is that when we look at the Bible and we see a particular outcome, Kevin had Coke. That's the outcome. Who determined that Kevin was going to have Coke? What I'm saying is when we study the Bible, we always have to provide two answers to that question. Kevin determined it, and so did God. So let's actually look at some scripture, and I think it'll help you at least
Because
frame
where
the
I
question.
get confused is when they say, when we get to the eternal aspect,
Yes.
that he will hold those accountable who did not choose Christ.
That's right.
And that's where it's that question, how
Mhm.
can God hold them? And that's where it's in this.
It is.
It's in there.
It is in here, and I
that's where
think
I'm all fuzzy.
I think we're probably going to get to that next week. We'll wrap up this freedom stuff next week. Right now, what I want to show is that the Bible is arguing for this view, and then we'll unpack some implications of this view next week.
Okay.
So the first example, the Joseph story from Genesis 37, and this story is interwoven with other things. So it's Genesis 37, then it picks up again in 45, and picks up again in 50. So we're going to look at this. I want you to notice the pronouns. Remember back, those of you who took the methodical Bible study classes about tracing pronouns. It's one of the most powerful tools in studying the Bible, and you can do it. You don't need to know Hebrew or Greek to do it. So let's look at this. Let's look at these pronouns carefully. They saw him from afar. By the way, if you don't know the story, this is about Joseph being sold. His brothers are jealous of him, and they sell him off into slavery, and he ends up in Egypt. And so if we ask who determined that Joseph was going to be sold into slavery in Egypt, we have to say his brothers did and God did. We have to provide two answers to that question. They saw him from afar, and before he came near, they conspired against him to kill him. So we're talking about Joseph and his brothers. And what does Genesis 37:18 say? Who conspired to kill him? His brothers. They They said to one another, here comes this dreamer, come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. You see that? Who's making these decisions? The brothers are. Then we will say that a fierce animal's devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So again, Reuben is trying to set up the brothers so he can be the hero. But so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe. Who did this?
They did.
Who decided that was going to happen?
Brothers.
They did. The robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him in the pit. Who threw him in the pit?
The brothers.
And who decided that Joseph was going to end up in the pit? The brothers. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. They sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum and balm and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother? They're planning this stuff. They're planning it.
Yeah.
And conceal his blood. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let our hand not be upon him. Who decides to sell him?
Brothers.
The brothers. For he's our brother in our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him. Who did that?
The brothers.
So who's responsible for this?
They are.
They are. Who determined that this is the future outcome that would happen? They did. But when the story picks up a few chapters later, we're given a little different perspective on this same set of events, and we get a little bit broader picture. And in fact, in the same sentences, you're going to see something happening that has to do with agency, that has to do with who's determining and who's deciding what happens. Joseph says that his brothers sold him into Egypt, but then he also is going to say that God did it. And he's going to actually emphasize God's role in their actions by telling his brothers. Now, we just saw this whole thing. Now, Joseph is going to tell them, it was not you who sold me here, but God. So it's clear that the statement is not intended to deny that the brothers did this, but rather it was Joseph's way of emphasizing that God also had a purpose that he was fulfilling even through their sinful actions. So even their evil choices ended up being part of the means that God uses to bring about his good ends. So let's look at this when we pick up. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near, and he said, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Who sold him?
Brothers.
The brothers. I just want to make sure this is clear.
Okay.
And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. You did this to me. For God sent me before you to preserve your life. Do you see in that same sentence?
Yeah,
You
same
did this.
sentence.
God did this.
Yeah.
For the famine has been in the land these 2 years. There are yet 5 years in which there will be neither keeping or plowing or harvest. And God sent me, forgot to emphasize that one, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over the land of Egypt. Well, now wait a minute. Who sent him? You have to give two answers to that question.
Wow.
Joseph is not confused. The shift in the narrative is intended to reveal something that we wouldn't know apart from faith, right? Nobody would be able to see this apart from confidence in God's providence. Now, as we reach the end of this story, the brothers clearly understand that they're responsible for what happens. And so this series of events was really the result of their actions. They freely made these choices. Nobody forced them to do any of this. It was their own motivations, their own desires, which happened to be, in this case, sinful desires. And God actually uses those sinful desires. God's working his plan through their sin in order to bring about a blessing to the very people, in this case, who are sinning against him. So there's some profound things here. But Joseph recognizes that it's not just random. It's not. He's not just at the whim of what they're choosing to do, even though he really is reaping the consequences of what they decide to do. He recognized that God is working out a plan through their choices, and it's going to result ultimately in what God has planned to do. And so we see Joseph's trust in God when he makes that famous statement, "You meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good." Now that's a really important statement, because look at that. There's two sets of intent around the same decisions. You meant it, and God meant it. And now I have heard teachers and preachers explain this verse, I don't know how many times, and the way that they explain it is that God used their sinful acts. Like God took them and improved it, or made it better, or used it in some way to bring about his purposes. Or I've even heard people say God sort of worked with it and did the best he could with it. That is nonsense. This is not what the text says. Certainly not that last thing, but it also doesn't even just say God used these circumstances. God had intent in those decisions. God meant it. The brothers meant it. They had an intention, but so did God. And so if we ask the question, who is responsible for Joseph ending up in Egypt? We have to give two answers. We have to say that the brothers are responsible, and so is God responsible. God didn't force these brothers to do this. It's not like they were trying to keep them from Egypt and God forced them to do this. Nothing like that. They did what they desired to do. And they chose according to their own sinful and selfish natures. Their choices, however, were part of the larger plan of God to protect and provide for his people. So God is not responding and reacting to human choices as if he's watching to see what happens and then says, oh man, I better fix this. But he actually is providentially working through them. There's intent. God meant this for good. You meant it for evil. There's two intentions related to the same action, and they're compatible. There's not a logical problem, which we can talk about more next week. Is there a logical issue with this? There's not, but let's see where this picks up. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil we did to him." So even though Joseph told them, look, God's hand was in this, he meant this, he sent me, they recognized who's responsible for what they did. They recognized that these actions were sinful, hurtful, and that they're responsible for them. You see that? Mm-hmm. And they're worried about it because when the dad dies, they're not sure what he's going to do. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you." They really did. That actually happened. Those were real choices with real consequences. "And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of God your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came, fell down before him, and said, "Behold, we're your servants." But that's when Joseph says this, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." So you can see here, and I'm going to give you a couple other examples. You can see here how the future can be determined by God. These actions, even these sinful, wrong choices, are working together as a part of a future that God has determined that is certain. Think about this broadly, and I don't want to get too hung up on this. What happens if Joseph doesn't go to Egypt? What happens if the Jews don't go to Egypt?
They die in the famine.
They die in the famine. What is the implication for the redemptive history and the promise that was made in the garden? The covenant people are gone. That can't happen.
That can't happen, yeah.
So even though this is their choice, it's all part of a plan that God has. Now, is God somehow unjust in holding them responsible for what they did? No, because why not?
They meant it.
it's not like they're robots. They did this, and they were the source of this decision. It was a sinful decision, and we're going to get in. This opens the door to, the relationship of a particular sinful act to God versus the person performing it. But that's a little bit deeper issue. So maybe we'll have time later. I want to keep on this issue here of they made the decision, even though they would not have been able to actualize a different future. Joseph was going to end up in Egypt, and he ended up there through their free choices, but it was certain he would. Are you seeing this, how it starts to come together? Two intentions, two wills, two sets of choices that determine that Joseph will end up in Egypt, compatible with one another. So let's look at the second example. And I think this is one you don't hear mentioned very often, and I think it's even more clear. But that is the example from Isaiah 10, from the king is an example related to the king of Assyria. I think the moral dynamic here becomes even more clear than in the Joseph story. And so here we see both the divine and the human will resulting in a set of events. And what's really nice about this example is we can see how the moral accountability works with regard to these choices. So, one of the questions that comes up a lot is, well, how can God be just in holding somebody accountable for doing what he determined would be done? I think you see the answer to that here. I think we saw a little bit of it in Joseph. We're going to see it again here. Look at this. Isaiah 10, beginning, I think, at verse 5. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him to take spoil and seize plunder and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Now, most of the time we just read this stuff, We have to stop for a second and think about this. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. What is a woe? A pronouncement of woe is what?
Doom.
Doom. It's a curse. Curse you, Assyria, the rod of my anger.
Yeah.
Like we just read this, you should stop. Like you should hear that screeching brakes sound when you get to something like this. Say, wait a minute. God is cursing them. And in the very next, like in the same phrase, he's cursing them for what they're about to do, which is what he's using them to do. Wait a minute, how does that work? Why is the king in trouble for doing what God is using him to do? Well, we're going to see why, but I just think, who is bringing this destruction? God is. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. Against a godless nation, I send him. Who sends this king?
God.
God does. Against the people of my wrath, I command him. You see that? Mm-hmm. And what does he command him to do? To take spoil and seize plunder and tread on them. And then he's going to punish them for doing this. You go, well, how does that work? It's an amazing passage. God begins by pronouncing the curse, and then, the description of what's going to happen here. So here we have God cursing a pagan king because of what God is going to use him to do. Now, Israel's choices led to God bringing judgment through an even more godless king. Israel was godless, so God is bringing an even more godless power to come punish them. And then God will punish the king. So the first thing that I want us to see as we think through this is the compatibilism between this king's choices and why he's doing what he's doing and what God is doing in that same set of circumstances. Because it becomes very clear in the next verse. But he does not so intend, and his heart does not so think, but it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off nations, not a few. So God says, woe to Assyria. Curse you, king of Assyria. I'm going to use you. I'm going to send you. I'm going to command you. I am going to use you as a tool to accomplish my ends. That's what God's saying about this king. But that's not why he's doing it. That's not why the king is doing it. What is his intention? To sin. He's arrogant. He's prideful. It says his heart does not so think. Think what? He's not saying, I am a righteous servant of the Lord. I'm going to make myself available to be used by God to accomplish his purposes. He doesn't even realize that God is doing this with him. It's in his heart to destroy and to cut off. So again, when we come to the decision point, who decides that Syria is going to attack Israel?
The king of Syria and God.
And God. Right? Two different intentions for two very different purposes with two very different motives. One is sinful, but that same sinful act conducted by that king is not a sinful choice by God. It's a righteous choice by God. Same action. And what does the king say? He says, and God's giving this as an explanation, or Isaiah's giving this as an explanation as to why he knows this isn't the intention of the king. Look what the king says. Are not my commanders all kings? Is not Calno like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad, and Samaria like Damascus? As my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols, whose carved images were greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and her idols as I have done to Samaria and her images? What is he saying? Your God's no big deal.
Yeah.
I've beat bigger, badder gods than yours. And God's saying, I'm using this king as a tool of my vengeance. But what does the king think? He thinks he's doing this.
He has free will.
He thinks he has liberty and free will. So we see here two different purposes, two different intentions behind the same decision. Similar to the Joseph story, we see that God has a good purpose, but there's also this evil purpose at work. The king is doing something totally different in the same actions. And so he's arrogant and wants to destroy Israel. And God's working through even his sinful desires to bring about his purposes, which is to punish Israel and bring them to repentance. So the king's making free choices. He's doing what he wants to do. So he's accountable. Why can God, why is it just for God to hold this king accountable? Look what he thinks. He can just go do whatever he wants to God's people. Yeah. And yet God is using him to do these very things, but for a very different reason. So then the passage picks up here, and I didn't want to leave us hanging there. So even though we've kind of made the point, I want to read what else happens. When the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the boastful look in his eyes. For he says, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding. I have removed the boundaries of the people and plundered their treasures. Like a bull, I bring down those who sit on thrones. My hand has found like the nest, the wealth of peoples. And as one gathers eggs that have been forsaken, so I have gathered from all the earth. And there was none that moved a wing or opened a mouth or chirped. Shall the axe boast over him who hews with it? So up to this point is what the king is saying. Now we see, so the axe boast over him who hews with it, and the saw magnify itself against the one who wields it, as if a rod should wield him who lifts it, or as if a staff should lift him who is not wood. So this king saying, I did this, and I did this. I can take what I want. I can plunder what I want. I am smart enough. I am strong enough. I have these resources to do these things. And look at everything I've done. And God says that's like an axe boasting against the one who's swinging it. And by the way, I mean, just a quick observation. This is one of the reasons why it's so difficult. We have to be so careful about trying to decipher God's providence in a particular situation. That's why, when we look at something and we try to evaluate it, even if we're meditating and prayerfully trying to evaluate it, there should always be a very strong caution there about trying to interpret what God is doing from what we can see. Because this king, his track record was great. And how often do we see this in ministry? people like, well, I've been blessed. Everything I've done is work. So what I'm doing must be blessed by God, when God may be using them for a completely different purpose. So the Word of God is where we have to get our discernment anchors from. We can't observe things, and I mean, God is working on such long perspectives that in a moment it's very difficult to understand always sometimes what's really happening. You know, I'm sure all of us have experienced that, where 20 years later you look back and go, oh my goodness, look what the Lord did there. But in the moment you're like thinking it was going somewhere completely different. So we have to be careful about that. And that's what this king does. He thought he had it all figured out, and not so much. Okay. So do you see there how the whole moral accountability, you know, God is completely just holding him accountable because his motivation is completely sinful. But it's a free act. He does this. The king decides to attack. Okay, and the fourth one, and listen, we could be here for weeks and months going through examples, but I think this is the most powerful one, the one that, you know, is just, I think, the most clear. The most dramatic example of compatibilism, I think we see, is in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The Bible tells us that it was the plan of God that Christ would be sacrificed. There are numerous prophecies in the Old Testament related to the suffering of the Messiah. In fact, when the Apostle Paul is preaching over and over in the New Testament, he draws from the Old Testament. And what are the two things he always says about the Old Testament with relation to his message? That it was predicted beforehand, the sufferings of Christ and the glory to follow. So there's a lot of details in the life of Christ that obviously are difficult to see in the Old Testament. But the suffering of the Messiah and the glory to follow is clear. I mean, all through the Old Testament, you know, you have those prophecies being made about this coming one. So hundreds of years, just to give you a taste, we don't have time to get into all of them. There are a lot of them. But hundreds of years before Jesus was born, the prophet Isaiah revealed God's intentions in what was going to happen, the death of his son. In Isaiah 53, probably the clearest Old Testament passage, maybe Psalm 22, one of the clearest ones anyway. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people, and that they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. So again, there's a lot of prophecy in the Old Testament about the suffering and crucifixion of Christ. You know, they will look upon him whom they have pierced. There's a lot of them. We can't begin to get our minds around what the sovereignty of God is or the providence of God is unless we can get our minds around this phrase, that it was the will of the Lord to crush him. The older translation, it pleased the Lord to crush him. So Jesus Christ, the perfect Son of God, the God-man, it was the will of the Father to crush him. That is such a difficult concept just for the flesh to absorb, that there are many people who profess to be Christians who can't accept it. I would say you can't understand the gospel if you can't understand what that is about. Not that you're going to perfectly understand it, because there's some mystery to that, like how does that work? But when Jesus was born, he was born to die. That was the plan. He's referred to as the Lamb of God slain before the foundation of the world. That was going to happen. That was God's plan. And so let's look at how this is handled, this set of events, which is at the same time, depending on which perspective you look at it, the most evil action that has ever occurred in the history of the universe. That sinful men put to death the Son of God, who came to preach the gospel to them. And at the same time, it is the most glorious act of love that's ever occurred. It's the same event, and it's both. Peter, in his well-known sermon recorded in Acts 2, also touches upon both the human and the divine intention when he talks about the crucifixion of Christ. Peter makes it clear that human decisions led to the death of Christ. But like Joseph's story, this is also part of the plan. Here's what Peter says in Acts 2. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Well, you see both right there. Who delivered Christ up? God did. Who else? The laws of endless men resulted in him being delivered up. And then later in chapter 4, when Peter and John are released from custody and are praising God, they mention both the human and the divine intentions involved in the crucifixion again. And this time, I think it's even a little more clear in terms of what we're talking about, the relationship here. Sort of drawing on the Psalms and so forth, they say, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and his anointed. So who is gathered together? The rulers. For truly in this city they were gathered together against your holy, they were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel. So you see this crowd gathering. These leaders. So we've got a king of Judea, we've got a Roman official, we've got Gentiles, and we got the people of Israel. Who's involved in the death of Christ? Everybody.
Yeah.
To do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. You see that? All these people are gathered together. They're making all kinds of plans. They're making all kinds of decisions. They're scheming and figuring out how are we going to do all this. Yeah. And you know what ends up being? Exactly what God planned was going to happen. Well, are they making free choices? Yeah, I mean, they're doing what they want to do. And they're probably quite proud of themselves remember, and this is the insane thing, Satan enters Judas to betray him. And drives the nail right in his own coffin.
Yes.
I mean, so they're making choices that they obviously want to do and believe are going to somehow further their agenda. But Peter says, look, they gathered together to do what you'd planned was going to happen. So the Bible teaches that there are two distinct purposes at work in the same events leading to the death of Christ. There are the sinful acts of human beings, and there's also the plan of God. Now, are they responsible for these sinful acts, these people? Yes, they are. I can tell you with 100% certainty they are. How do I know that? How might I know? I mean, because I'm not 100% certain that I'm even here this morning. So how would I be certain about that? Because when Jesus is being nailed to the cross, he intercedes for them and asks forgiveness for them. But you don't have to.
He as God is recognizing their guilt.
Their guilt before the Father.
Okay.
Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
So he was already carrying this in.
Yeah, well, he's already functioning as the.
Nailing him,
while
he's
they're
already
he's already interceding on behalf of these sinners. And if you ever have a chance. If you're a student of sermons, I like to listen to sermons and analyze kind of how they're put together and everything. There's a wonderful narrative sermon by Peter Marshall called Were You There? I think you can get it on Sermon Audio. It's a powerful message, and he just does a great job of capturing that. And so I would recommend that. Obviously, I wish I could say broad-bordered phylacteries the way that Peter Marshall says it.
You're not Scottish.
I know, I'll never be able to account. But anyway, Sorry for that diversion, but it's a sermon I recommend everybody hear. God did not force them to do what they did. The guilt is recognized even in Christ's intercession for them as this is going on. They're choosing according to their desires and their motives, but there's another purpose in what's happening, another cause of the events. And so if we ask who determined that Jesus would be crucified, we have to provide two answers. Sinners determined that, and God did. And this question actually comes up a lot. Like, who decided that Jesus was going to... I got asked this question. I was on part of a panel discussion one time. They had some teachers on there, and people were asking questions. Somebody said, who decided that Jesus would be crucified? Was it, they were asking basically, was it the Romans or the Jews? Right? Because Pilate washes his hands. They say crucify him, but really they didn't have the authority to do that. He had to do that. So he sort of delegated the authority. Well, people were getting into all that, and I just said, he decided he was going to be crucified. That's who decided it. Well, the answer is both, right? And so we can kind of think through the implications of this stuff by just picking any single person that was involved in the events, and Judas is an obvious one to think about here. Consider Judas for a moment. Did Judas have libertine free will? Could he have decided not to betray Jesus? At that moment, could he have said that, you know what, I'm not going to kiss him? Well, if you're looking at it from Judas's perspective, he makes a real choice. He has to do that. But it's certain that he's going to do that. He can't not do that. Not because something outside of him is forcing him to do it, but he's going to do it. He's got to do it, because if he doesn't, he would invalidate numerous prophecies, and it would make Jesus wrong, who selected him. Have I not chosen you 12, and one of you is a devil, right? So look at some of these passages related to Judas. I mean, Psalm 41 predicts that it's going to be a member of his inner circle, one of his friends, is going to betray him. Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. Some of the details in terms of the pieces of silver and all of those things are prophesied as well. But let's just look at what Jesus says about Judas. John 6:70. Jesus answered them, did I not choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is a devil? He spoke of Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, for he was one of the 12, who was going to betray him. Jesus knew Judas was going to betray him. In fact, that's why Judas gets to become part of the 12. John 17:12. While I was with them, I kept them in your name, which you have given me. I have guarded them, and not one of them has been lost, except the son of destruction, that the scripture may be fulfilled. So Judas is mentioned there. So if we understand free will in the way that most people talk about it, this libertine free will view, this idea that you can make contrary choices in any set of circumstances, you could have done something different, which would have different future results. We have to say that Judas could not possibly have had this kind of, it can't work this way. It really can't work this way within at least classical Christian theology, because it creates a real problem. And there is a theology that tries to accommodate this called open theology, where God doesn't know the future and he's doing the best he can. I mean, I don't think that's biblical. There's a lot of problems with that. But if we say that Judas could have decided not to betray Christ, then the whole plan of redemption unravels. You can't really have that. So now some people suggest that, well, if Judas had decided not to go through with it, God would have found another way. Well, the problem with that is that Jesus selected Judas for that purpose and knew that was the plan, right? But if you have a compatibilist view, it explains the whole Judas situation perfectly, because Judas is making a free choice for which he's responsible. Nobody forces Judas to do this, but God's plan includes his free choices. God works through creatures in accordance with their nature. So Judas's nature was such that he was going to do this, and God uses him through his own free choices to bring about what God determined with 100% certainty was going to happen. So we can see in these three examples that we've looked at that God's plans infallibly come to pass. When he makes promises, you can take him to the bank. He's going to follow through on those promises. And in order to make those kind of promises, think about how interconnected choices are and decisions are. In order to know with certainty a particular outcome, you've got to have certainty about the interrelation of intentions that are going to lead to the outcome. Now, there are other ways to look at how much freedom you have in the interim, and we'll talk about that next week. But the point is that libertine freedom does not seem to be a very good understanding of what we see in the scripture, where God is working on a plan and there's actual choices being made. That this compatibilist view is much more consistent with what I think we see throughout the scripture. So that's why, so when people say, well, do people have free will? The answer is it depends. If you mean what most people mean, I would say the Bible would say no. But the problem with that answer is then people think, oh, are we robots? Or it's a little more complicated than that. You've got to really pay attention and meditate upon what the scripture's saying. So God determines what's going to happen, but he does so in a way that doesn't violate the ability of people to act according to their own desires. To deny human agency in bringing about these events that we've looked at is to deny what the passages say. Joseph's brothers actually decided to sell him into slavery. That was their choice. Judas actually decides to betray the Lord. The Assyrian king actually decides to invade. And that decision leads to a series of actions that are their actions. And had those actions not occurred, the future would have been different. But it's certain that those actions would happen the way they did because that was God's plan. So they're responsible, they're real choices, but we can't deny that God is also at work in all of these situations to bring about what he plans to do. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about this next week. We'll wrap this up next week and then we'll move on to election. But one of the key things is that God works through creatures in accordance with their nature. He's not forcing people to do things they don't want to do. And he's not preventing people from doing things they want to do. They are the source of the desires and motivations that lead to the choices, which is why if you think all the way back to irresistible grace and total depravity, the way I explained what happens in the new birth is that there is a transformation of affections, knowledge and affections. And that directly weighs upon your greatest desires and the motivations for which you're making choices. So we'll bring this all back together next week. But we don't see in the Bible, or at least I don't see in the Bible, that anywhere where it says that human beings have the power of contrary choice in the way that libertine freedom does. I rather see something much closer to this, which is people make real choices, they do what you're going to do, but in the end, it's going to work out the way God has planned it. We don't have the power to veto God's plan with our choices. And we could have looked at a lot of other passages, but I think these three are pretty clear, hopefully. Yes, sir.
One thing that helps me a lot with this sort of thing is, like, God will always do what brings him the most glory.
Yep.
And you know what? Everything fits together with that. Everything. All from beginning to end of the Bible and everything I see in life, God will always do what maximizes his glory. What's important there is I have a choice. Am I going to get behind that?
Right.
Or am I going to go pursue my own glory or whatever it is? So you know what? That's the choice.
Yeah.
Do I want to honor God and pursue his glory or not?
Right.
Yes or no?
That's right. And yet
That's my free will. That's my choice.
That's right.
But that's the way it works.
And yet God is going to make sure that it happens the way he planned to happen. I mean, Jonah wasn't going to Nineveh, right? So there are times where, I mean, this all happens through our motivation, but there are also examples in the scripture where God directly intervenes, I think kind of to prove a point. But, you know, we think we're in control, but you know, a fish might just spit you up where he wants you to as well. But there is a place in the scripture, and it was interesting, nobody called me on it, but there is a place where this question is asked directly in Romans 9, where Paul says, well, how does he find fault? Who can resist his will? And the answer is one that we don't like. And Paul says, who are you? That's the answer. Like, and we'll look at that when we get to election, because we're going to unpack Romans 9 a little bit. But the point is, doesn't a potter have the right over the vessels to do what he wants and to create what he wants? Excuse me. Meaning, God's working through creatures in accordance with their nature. That's good. That's an important thing to remember. So God doesn't cause somebody to do sinful acts. God didn't cause Joseph's brothers to be sinful. They were sinful, and God's plan included those sinful desires that proceeded from their own hearts. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next time. But any other last questions, comments, or thoughts?
Just thinking of Pharaoh being another great example. God knew he wasn't going to let, but told Moses, go tell him.
Well, and see, God even hardens his heart.
Yeah.
And so that raises a big question, like, well, so God hardens his heart, but after Pharaoh, see, Pharaoh's already resistant.
Yeah.
God's working in accordance with his nature. God doesn't take a holy person who wants to comply and make him hard.
Right.
But he takes Pharaoh as a sinner and pushes him further down that path that he was going. You know, he hardens him. So two things.
That's where he can hold them accountable. He's working with their nature.
Yes.
And if man's nature is deceitful and wicked beyond, as Jeremiah said, the heart is this, you know, that is where God can hold them accountable for choosing.
Yeah, he's not the author of the sin.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, and we'll talk about a couple of those logical problems next week. But the other thing to keep in mind with that is that's why irresistible grace has to be a gracious act of God and can't proceed from us. So what he does there is he intercedes to change our nature. We're given a new nature. So now God can work within us as partners, essentially. What he says in Ephesians is we're ministers and we get to participate in the administration of the glory. So in fact, and this is sort of mind-blowing, goes beyond the scope of this course, but I think it's Peter at one point says, we become partakers of the divine nature in our union with Christ, which is, I would love to do a whole class on union with Christ, because I think if it was better understood, people would have more confidence in their faith. But so we go from that. That's why it's completely an act of grace. If God had only worked through us consistent with our nature, we'd all end up going to hell. But, all right.
I'm thinking of two other things you were saying in relation to Job, as far as being very careful to not assume we know what God is doing. That's kind of the nature of Job's friends.
Yeah, I mean, that's, they come and they start telling him, you must have done something.
Yeah, but, and then the answer wasn't an answer. It's not like God told him about chapter 1 that we got to see. He didn't. He just said, he gave the Romans answer. Who are you, Job?
Right.
And just let it lie, and Job got it.
Job gets his answer, and the answer is he gets to really understand who God is.
Now I've seen you. I've just heard about you, and now.
So it's, I think the two extremes we have to avoid is saying, well, God's in control, so it doesn't matter what I do. That's one extreme, which is unbiblical and needs to be avoided, because you're making real choices. You're going to be held accountable for them.
Yeah.
And without works of righteousness, you won't see God. Not that that's the basis upon which, that's the whole point of this course, right? That's not the foundation or the basis by which, but if that has happened, you need to have, we'll talk about that when we get perseverance. That's one extreme. And the other extreme is assuming, like this Assyrian king, Like we're just doing stuff and it's us. And that God isn't working through things. And so there's a little bit of a balancing that needs to be held in tension in our minds. But I think ultimately what we see in the scripture is what God decrees will happen certainly happens. Yeah. And yet it happens through all these choices people are making, and he's not forcing them. There's no puppeteering going on here. And I think that makes God so much bigger in my view.
Wow. Yeah.
But, all right. Any last questions, Beth Ann? No, you're good. All right. God bless. Have a great week.
You're better when you